are a part of the LGBTQ community, but adding on all the letters may make it hard to decipher or hard to understand. For example, non-binary people are people who don't quite fit perfectly into the male or female binaries, and they may want to use they, them pronouns. Intersex people it can get a little confusing, but someone who, for example, presents female on the outside, but their genes and DNA may be male. The science on that is a little not fully understood, but their chromosomes and DNA could be different from what's seen on the outside. So now I'm going to go on to where the acronym originate from. So when researching this question, it was hard for me to pin an exact date and time because there was no set date that the acronym came into existence. It was formed over many, many decades, and depending on how well society took to it or how much it was used, influenced the term being created. Starting with the 19th century, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who was a German lawyer and writer, and who was a gay man himself, tried identifying his own community. He did this with the term yearning, and it referred to men who were attracted to other men. But it did not take long for that term to be replaced with homosexuality by Carly Maria Kurtbenny, an Austro-Hungarian in the year 1869. She's also credited with the term heterosexual. Skipping to the 1960s, the word gay becomes more popular. Queer, gay was originally another slur that was used against the LGBT community, but soon it was embraced by men who challenged the status quo by openly loving other gay men. The first acronym was only LGB, and it came about in the 1990s. The T was added later on. Because of the long-standing bonds between lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, through activism and just in daily life, allowed for the acronym to start to form in the adoption of it. In terms of the word transgender being added to the acronym, that took longer to gain acceptance. It was only in the 1960s that the term transgender. In the earliest place we can trace the word being used, at least in written form, was in a 1965 psychology textbook. This textbook, called Sexual Hygiene and Pathology, was John F. Sullivan, a teacher and psychiatrist who worked at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York. Transgender was added to the LGBT in the early 2000s and became embraced as the LGBT rights movement. The Q was added more recently, but it has been in use since the 1910s. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the clobber passages. I took that term from Colby Martin, who is a pastor in San Diego, and he wrote a few books, including the topic which I'm discussing now. Clobber passages simply refer to the 6 passages that have been used historically to discriminate gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. I will be arguing that the Bible is not against gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, and like I said in the beginning, I don't know where all of you stand on this topic. I know some of you might agree, and I expect a lot of you to not agree, but I hope that we can get through this presentation with respect and kindness. I just pray that what I will say will not change how you view me as a person, and it will not sever any relationships that we have. So the 6 passages I will be discussing today have been used to treat LGBTQ people poorly. The first passage I will be discussing is Genesis 19, chapter 1 through 29. It's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The second and third passages are from Leviticus, chapter 18, 22, and 20:13. Those 3 are from the Old Testament, and from the New Testament, I will be talking about Romans 1, verses 26 through 27, 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10, and 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 10. There will be an opportunity at the end if you want to ask any questions about it. So, starting with Genesis 19, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Some background in the book of Genesis: Moses is credited with writing the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is also known as the Torah, which is the holy book of the Jews. It was written sometime between the 13th and 15th century BCE, and it was written for the Israelites to clarify their identity with God and covenant with God. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is in the book of Genesis. I don't have enough time to read the entire scripture to you, so I will just summarize it. So the summary is the following. God plans on destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because of its wickedness. He talks about this with Abraham in Genesis 18, and Abraham pleads with God to not destroy the city. And his argument was, why would you destroy the city, the wicked people in Sodom, if there are righteous people within it? So because of that, that sets the stage for Genesis 19. God sends 2 angels into the city of Sodom in search of any righteous people. The 2 angels come to the city where Lot finds them. Lot is Abraham's nephew. Lot welcomes them and invites them into his home. The 2 angels are resistant at first, but after some back and forth, the angels accept, but then the following happens. I pull this from Genesis 19, verse 4 and 5. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who come to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." I pulled this from the Revised Standard Version because it's the translation we have in this church. Going back to the story, Lot refuses to allow anything to happen to the 2 angels because they come under the protection of his house. And because of this, Lot offers up his 2 daughters to the crowd instead. The crowd becomes very violent, and the 2 angels help Lot and his family flee the city before it is destroyed. This is not a story about same-sex orientation, which is often people think it is, but it is about inhospitality and a violent abuse of power. And I can tell you how I come to that conclusion. So I want to compare both Genesis 18 and 19. Looking at them side by side, in chapter 18, 3 angels appear outside of Abraham's tent. Without knowing who they are, Abraham runs to greet them, prepares a feast, gives them water, shade, and rest. He welcomes them with everything that he has. And these strangers turns out to be angels, and God blesses Abraham for his hospitality. Then, in Genesis 19, 2 of the angels travel to Sodom. They're greeted by Lot, who invites them into their home, trying to follow that same custom of hospitality. But the men of the city surround the house and demand to violate the guests. This was not about romantic attraction. This was about violence, humiliation, and dominance, and a complete rejection of God's call to care for the vulnerable and welcome the stranger. So these stories side by side, I see a clear contrast. Abraham, who was righteous through radical hospitality, but the city of Sodom, who is wicked through violent inhospitality. In the ancient world, showing hospitality was very important. It was not just about showing good manners, it was a matter of life and death. Travelers depended heavily on the kindness of strangers for food, protection, and shelter. Hospitality towards the stranger was a duty, and in the New Testament, Jesus even praises those who feed the hungry, welcome the stranger, and clothe the naked, linking hospitality with righteousness. You can find that in Matthew chapter 25. If you lived in this ancient world and wanted to talk about a culture or a specific people, you would talk about how hospitable they were to guests. And if you wanted to talk about how bad they were, you would mention their lack of hospitality. People who did not care for the outsider or their guests were seen as wicked and cruel. And shifting gears a little bit, if you want to show or display the amount of power you had, you would dominate and humiliate your enemy. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah did exactly that. They wanted to dominate and humiliate the 2 angels that Lot welcomed into his house. The men of Sodom wanted to assert control, and they would strip the other men of their honor and status, bringing them down to the level of a woman. They would do this display of power by raping the 2 angels. Women were seen as property and inferior to men in this ancient world. The men of Sodom wanted to treat the 2 angels in that manner. The men of Sodom were rejecting the hospitality custom entirely, which is the exact opposite of what God wanted them to do. This also explains why Lot offered up his 2 daughters. As horrifying as that sounds, because women were seen as property and inferior to men, Lot was trying to protect the dignity and honor of the 2 angels. And one final thing to mention, there is no possible way that all of the men of Sodom were gay. In the scripture, it mentions all of the men of Sodom, young and old, all of them approached Lot's house. I can prove too that not all the men were gay based on the statistics of gay people today. So it was hard for me to find this information, but there were roughly 600 to 1,200 people who lived in the city of Sodom. It's not possible that all 600 to 1,200 were gay, and I can come to that conclusion based on the percentage of gay people today in the United States. This is from 2023. It's the most recent study I could find. So the total population in the US for 2023 was roughly 335 million people. 7.6% of that identified as LGBTQ. The 7.6% would roughly come out to 25.5 million people, or about 1 in every 13. If you look up the percentages of gay people in previous years, that percentage is even smaller. Applying this logic to the men of Sodom, there is no chance that all 600 or more, depending on the number you use, were gay. There might have been some, but that cannot represent the entire body. Furthermore, if these men were truly gay, Lot would not offer up his 2 daughters because they wouldn't be interested in them. This reinforces the idea that this is not about sexual preference, but that the men of Sodom wanted to rape the angels. Sodom is mentioned a few more times in the Bible, and the focus is never on homosexuality. One example is in the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. I pulled this from Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 49 through 50. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw it. So the Bible itself interprets Sodom's sin as pride, cruelty, and a failure to welcome strangers, not consensual same-sex relationships. So now we're going to move on to the book of Leviticus, but before I do that, does anyone have any questions about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay, so for Leviticus, there's 2 verses. I'm going to pair them together because they are very similar. The only difference is that in Leviticus 20:13, it adds the death penalty at the end of the sentence. So before we get into detail with the verses, I want to share some context on the book of Leviticus. It was written by Moses roughly between the 13th and 15th century BCE. It is hard to find an exact date. It was the second of 5 books in the Torah, which is the holy book of the Jews. The audience for which this book was written was the Israelites, and the purpose of this book was to establish ritual and moral purity laws for ancient Israel. These laws were supposed to set Israel apart from neighboring nations and to live differently. The tribe of Levi, which is the priestly tribe and the tribe Moses comes from, is also credited with writing this book. But it was intended to guide the Israelite people into a new way of being human and how to function religiously toward God and one another. It is a collection of commands and laws compiled to show them how to be set apart from those living in Egypt, where they came from, and to the people in Canaan, where they are going. So going into the specific verses, again, I pulled this from the Revised Standard Version. They are the following. Leviticus 18:22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Leviticus 20:13, a man lies with a male as with a woman. Both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Okay. Leviticus 18:20 and 13 are often quoted and discussed in discussions about same-sex relationships, but it's important to understand them in their historical context. The verses addressed ritual practices in ancient cultures and the language used tied to cultural purity laws, most of which Christians no longer follow today. So these verses are a part of something called the Holiness Code, a section of Leviticus chapter 17 through 26, but more specifically, they are part of the ritual and purity laws that show up in chapters 11 through 15 and 18 through 20. The Holiness Code was written for the ancient Israelites, mostly focusing on setting them apart from their neighbors. It included laws about food, clothing, sex, farming, and worship. Some of these laws we still talk about, but many of them, like not eating shellfish or wearing mixed fabric and clothes, we don't follow anymore. The goal of the Holiness Code was not about morality. It was often about ritual purity, cultural separation, and a community survival in an ancient world. So knowing that, I want to talk about the term abomination. In Hebrew, the word comes from the word tova, and it refers to ritual impurity, not moral evil. For example, the Bible calls shellfish and pork tova, and tova is not about morality, but identity. If something violates cultural boundaries, it would be considered tova, and things that are tova could differ among cultures. So we need to ask, is this verse calling male same-sex inherently evil, or is it just a ritual taboo in ancient Israel's purity system? Shifting gears a little bit, men in Sodom, men were seen as dominant and women were seen as subordinate. So a man having sex as with a woman was seen as degrading, not because of the love or relationship, but because it violated the patriarchal hierarchy. This is about gender roles, not about equal loving relationships between the people of the same sex like we see today. It's also important to know that ancient Israel did not have a concept of sexual orientation as we do today. They weren't thinking about lifelong, committed same-sex relationships. They were thinking about power, idolatry, temple prostitution, and rape. So to apply this verse directly to modern LGBTQ people is like comparing apples to oranges. It's not the same. So this makes me think, why do some people keep this law but ignore others? Because Leviticus also says to not eat shrimp, to not plant two kinds of seeds together, and the punishment if you're an adulterer is to stone you. But Christians today believe that Jesus fulfilled the law and that we are no longer under the Old Testament legal system, which these two verses fall in. So why would we pull this one out to shame people, but when Jesus taught us to lead with love, justice, and compassion? Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 were about ritual purity, patriarchal genders, and cultural identity, not about condemning loving same-sex relationships. In the ancient world, these acts were never seen as an equal relationship. It was not about love, but about the man's status, and the worry of him losing his honor and being stripped of his status. Furthermore, focusing on specifically Leviticus 20:13, the words men and male have very different meanings. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew language has different nouns for male and man. Male and female has one noun, and there is a different noun for man and woman and husband and wife. Male and female would be considered like the general gender of something, when man and woman or husband and wife would be referred to a specific individual. So keeping this in mind, men would be referring to an adult man, and while male would be referring to an adolescent boy. Part of society back then was an older man would mentor a younger boy, but part of this mentoring was the older man would take advantage of the younger boy sexually, and the younger boy would have no say in this. The younger boy would be taken advantage of for the older man's pleasure, and it was exploitive and abusive, and considered pedophilia. This was not about a loving, committed relationship. So that is it for the Old Testament scriptures. We're going to move on to the New Testament scriptures, unless someone has a question about, yeah.
I thought that quote was attributable to Jesus that you read from Leviticus. I thought Jesus had said that in context of what I was told by a minister was the context of that time was that there were a lot of wars going on, and the men were all, going off to war, and they were away from home for long periods of time, and they would then basically rape the younger men in their division, and that's why Jesus had made that statement, thou shalt not lie down with a male as you would a woman.
Yeah, I'm not sure about That, I don't know that I didn't know there were wars going on, but I can definitely talk about it afterwards. I'm unsure of what,
Well, I have it from the same source. I think you got a lot of your stuff.
okay. Yeah, I can definitely look into it, kind of what was happening around the world at that time. I'm unsure of whether or not it was a peacetime or if it was a wartime. Any other questions? Okay. So, for the New Testament, there are 3 key passages that people often cite. It is Romans chapter 1, verse 26 through 27, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. On the surface, they do seem to condemn same-sex relationships, but when we dig into the history and language, the picture becomes more complex. Before we move on to the New Testament, I do want to talk about the Apostle Paul and what he really meant when he referred to same-sex behavior. So, for those who don't know who Apostle Paul is, if you're not too familiar, he did write Romans, and he did have some influence on the book of Timothy as well. So, first we need to understand what the world was like that Paul lived in. The time period was the Roman Empire's views on sex were all about power and status, not love or mutuality. He could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or even teenage boys as long as they were considered the dominant partner. Loving, mutual, committed same-sex relationships, the kind that many LGBTQ people seek today, were almost non-existent in Paul's time. They weren't understood or respected. So when we go into the specific verse, Paul mentions men being consumed with passion for one another in Romans 1, or when he uses certain Greek terms in Corinthians and Timothy, he's addressing behaviors that were exploitive, lustful, or tied to idolatry, not modern faithful relationships. Paul was concerned with how people honored God and how they treated others and how they used their bodies responsibly. But he was not imagining 2 Christian men or women building a life together based in love and faith. That doesn't mean we ignore Paul. It means we read him in context with humility and discernment. We ask, what was Paul really addressing? What do these words mean to his original audience? And how does God speak through them today in a world where loving LGBTQ people and their relationships exist? So the first one, Romans 1, 26 to 27, is the first one that appears in the New Testament. The verse is as follows. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in their own persons their due penalty for error. I pulled this verse from the Revised Standard Version because that is a translation we have in this church. Other well-known translations, such as the King James Bible, used against nature instead of unnatural in verse 26, and in verse 27 it states burned with lust for one another in place of consumed with passion. So a little more information about the book of Romans. The Apostle Paul is the author, and it was written in between the years 56 and 58 AD. Paul wrote this on his 3rd missionary trip from Corinth, which is a major city in Greece. Furthermore, Paul was writing this to the churches of his time. The purpose of the book of Romans is to lay out the plan of God for the nation of Israel. And it also could mean God's welcoming Gentiles into the family of God, and just a guide on how to live. So the context you need to know for this is that Paul is critiquing idolatry and exploitive or lustful practices linked to pagan rituals, not consensual same-sex relationships. In verses prior to verses 26 to 27, Paul writes about how the people were dishonoring their bodies and exchanging the truth about God for a lie and worshiping their creature rather than the creator. Additionally, the word natural can refer to what's customary for them at the time rather than something that's biologically natural. So unnatural could simply mean something that is uncommon for those individuals. Something that is natural today could be seen as unnatural in Paul's time. Something unnatural is like certain behaviors or actions that were deemed unacceptable. So this goes into the question that I have. Did Paul have loving, consensual, same-sex relationships in mind? The answer is no. Paul did not address the concept of loving committed same-sex relationships because he did not know about it. It wasn't a thing in his time. Paul lived in the first century Roman world where the concept of sexual orientation, which is an internal part of you, did not exist. People were generally categorized by what they did sexually, not who they were. When Paul describes men with men, he's addressing specific behavior, not the idea of two people of the same gender in a loving, mutual relationship. Paul's writings focus on behaviors he views as immoral, often in the context of idolatry and exploitation, not anything that resembles a modern, healthy, equal partnership. In short, Paul was not thinking about what we would now call a gay or marriage or partnership grounded in love, consent, and faithfulness. Having this in mind, I want to talk about my next question is how common was loving consensual same-sex relationships in Paul's time? It's kind of complicated. In the Greco-Roman world, same-sex behavior was relatively common, especially among men, but it was rarely equal. For example, pedestry was very widespread, especially among elite men of high status with younger boys, and then in between masters and their enslaved people. Enslaved people, male or female, were often sexually used by their masters with no possibility of consent. And finally, in terms of prostitution, male and female prostitutes were commonly used among men of all classes. But what was not common or respected was a mutual same-sex relationship between adult men or women, especially based off of love or long-term commitment. To try to bring everything together, Paul was talking about how people were turning away from God and started to worship idols. And this chapter talks about what would happen if you reject God, and rejecting God created excess lust and idol worship. So that is all for Romans 1. I am going to move on to the final two, unless people have questions about Romans 1. Okay. Yeah.
I believe you can back me up or argue with me. That in the Gospels, Jesus never mentioned anything about homosexuality.
Yes, so I was going to mention that briefly at the end. The only thing...
Because we went into the New Testament and it's clearly past the Gospels. Okay.
Yes, so in the Gospel, the thing that Jesus mentions about relationships, he talks about divorce and the reason you would get a divorce, but he does not mention anything about the specifics, whether between a man or a woman, and a man or a man. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, so I'm going to pair 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy together because they are very similar. 1 Corinthians, it's chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. Dad, you can switch to the next slide. Okay, so 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10 is as follows. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor sexual perverts, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor robbers will inherit the kingdom of God. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 through 10 is similar. It's just the wording's a little different. It states, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and mothers, for manslayers and immoral persons, sodomites, kidnappers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. Other translations, this is from the Revised Standard Version, but other translations of the Bible will use the words sodomites, homosexuals, male prostitutes, or effeminate. And moving on to 1 Corinthians, a little context about the book. Paul is the author, and he is writing the book to the church of Corinth. This was written about the year 55 AD, and the purpose of Paul writing this letter is because he heard reports about the people in Corinth. They were very divided, and Paul was commenting on the behavior that the people were doing, not their identity. Paul was making them aware that their actions were not representing the kingdom of God. The actions I'm talking about and how the people in Corinth were infamous for its sexual culture and pagan temples. It might be worth noting that the people in this church come from different backgrounds. I don't want to say half, but they were a mix between Gentiles and Jews. Paul's message and what he cared about is justice, holiness, and transformation. He was not addressing consensual, equal homosexual behavior. A little context on 1 Timothy. The book was written between 62 and 66 AD by Timothy, who was a disciple of Paul. Paul mentored him for several years, and the purpose of the book was to deal with pastoral conduct and to give warnings about false teaching. So now I want to break down 2 of the words in this passage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, sexual perverts come from the 2 Greek words arsenokoitai and malakoi. And then in 1 Timothy, the word sodomites comes from the Greek word arsenokoitai. These 2 words are often translated to sodomites, homosexuals, or men who practice homosexuality. But this is not the correct translation of these 2 words. So going on to the word specifically, the word arsenokoitai is a term coined by Paul, and he's the only one that uses it in the Bible. It is from the 1st century Greco-Roman world, and it's a combination of 2 Greek words. The first half, arsen, means male, and the second half, koitai, means bed. It literally translates to man better or men who lie with males. Going back onto what I said previously, the difference between the words men and male are very different, just because the Hebrew language has different nouns for them. So the word men describes adult men, male refers to boys or children. And the type of relationship that they had, an older man would often mentor the younger boy, but this typically involved pederasty. So this type of relationship, or a committed relationship, the younger boy would have no say in this. This word is also associated with exploitive sex, sexual greed, and temple practices, but not mutual romantic relationships. So moving on to the second word, the one on the right, malakoi is a Greek word that literally translates to soft, gentle, or effeminate. And this was used more often to describe laziness or moral weakness, not sexuality. What it was used to describe was soft clothing, a person with a soft or effeminate demeanor, or men who are morally or physically weak. Malakoi does not refer to gay men, and it often tied to prostitution or moral laziness, not loving LGBTQ relationships. Neither malakoi or arsenokoitai can be translated to homosexuals, at least not as we understand it today. Both terms reflect cultural taboos about power, gender roles, and sexual exploitation, not modern LGBTQ identity. So that's it for the New Testament. Before I move on to the last section of this, does anyone have any questions? If not, I'm going to move on to when homosexuality, that word first appeared in the Bible. So the word homosexuality did not appear in any Bible until the year 1946. For just short of 2,000 years, not a single English Bible used the word homosexual, but that changed with the Revised Standard Version, which was published in 1946. Before that, verses like 1 Corinthians and in older translation used vague phrases like effeminate, and those terms were very unclear. It did not carry the meaning we associate with homosexuality today. So my question is, why did it change? Well, this translation committee in 1946 chose to translate the 2 Greek words I just broke down into the English word homosexual. And that decision changed the course of church teaching and culture in the modern world. But here's the thing, that translation was a mistake, and the people who translated it later admitted it. Moving to the year 1959, a young seminary student named Edgar Scotty Smith wrote a letter to this translation committee challenging their term as homosexual, arguing that it was a mistranslation of Greek words. And one of the lead translators, known as Dr. David S., actually wrote back, and this is what he said. I think you were quite right in pointing out that homosexual is not a good translation. It is too specific. We are already working on a new translation of the New Testament. I hope that this correction can be made in it. He agreed with the student that sent him a letter. The word homosexual did not accurately reflect the original Greek, but it was too influenced by modern 20th century ideals about sexuality, but the word stayed. Once it appeared in this translation, it made its way into almost every modern Bible translation after that. This moment in 1946 was a turning point. It introduced a modern concept, homosexuality as an identity, into ancient texts that never used or even understood sexuality in that way. So that is my whole presentation. I do have a lot more information about terms of sort of like the scientific side of whether people are born gay or not, or I can go into the Bible translations at a different time, but that is it for my presentation. So thank you for coming. I can continue any conversation after, but I appreciate all of you coming. Thank you. Oh, any questions anyone has about my general presentation? Yeah. Yeah, so up until recently in the United Methodist Church Book of Principles, I don't know the exact wording, but the wording was homosexuality does not match Christian teachings. I think that was the term they used up until a conference in... Inconsistent with Christian teachings, but up until I think the last annual conference, they changed the wording in the United Methodist Church Book of Principles. They got rid of that sentence, so it doesn't say anything, but it was, the whole United Methodist Church had a vote, and if you wanted to keep that part, like if you did not agree that homosexuality had nothing, so, okay, let me restart. So the whole United Methodist Church had a vote, and if they voted that homosexuality was fine, they would stay within their conference. If they voted that homosexuality was wrong and was not consistent with Christian teachings, they could leave their conference. So I think the percentage was 52%, I may be wrong, but 52% of churches was fine with homosexuality and they stayed within their conference, but I know a lot of Methodist churches, I think in Africa and Asia, did not agree with that, so they left the conference and they're more independent. So the church is still pretty divided, and it was kind of up to every individual UMC church and their thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, so they're not united.
United. Mm-hmm. No, we're the ununited Methodist Church.
If they left the United Methodist Church, those churches are no longer United Methodist churches. They've left the church there. And I just had to comment that the discipline, even though the discipline stated that homosexuality was inconsistent with Bible teaching, it also love one another, and that we would be a loving our pastor perform marriages, same-sex.
Yes, so going.
The main difference.
Thank you very much. And I want to clarify some things. And 2024, we call it General Conference. So it's complicated. Even if you're a long-time Methodist, still confusing about that one. But we have a General Conference. That's the highest body. They renew the Book of Discipline. That is our constitution. Based on Book of Discipline, you should follow the rules. Pastor cannot overrule the Book of Discipline. So before 2024, we had the Book of Discipline saying homosexuality is incompatible with Jesus' teaching. That means that didn't say anything you cannot marry same-sex marriage, but just that one. But 2024, the United Methodist Church got rid of that statement. That means no more condemnation. So if you cannot accept it, some churches left. So our New York Annual Conference, only 4 churches left. But Texas Annual Conference, about 50% left. So more conservative, more church left. So only 4 churches left in our New York Annual Conference. Important thing is 2 issues. One, same-sex marriage and homosexuality's ordination. But each church has the authority to make a decision. You cannot condemn them, but it's up to the pastor. So some couple come to me and I want to get married at your church. And so it's up to the pastor. So bishop will appoint each pastor to the appropriate the church. So I'm not very conservative pastor. So if I was appointed to this church, the bishop knows each pastor's tendency. And if someone, even if heterosexual couple come to me and ask, I want to get married, I have a premarital session, and I decide if this couple is eligible to get married at our church. That means, but the United Methodist Church does not condemn homosexuality at all. That's the rule now. Any other questions or clarification about our denomination? I did a pretty good explanation, so I will disappear.
In preparation for this, who at a church in Connecticut. So they are both went the route where they're in support, and I know I'm not sure how were for it, but I know that it's really up to the. Any other questions?
This is from a girl who used to be up in this